Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. That is to say, we begin all things with the name of Allah, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise be to Allah, the guardian evolver, keeper, cherisher, and sustainer of all of the worlds. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wahdahu la sharika lah. I bear witness, I give open testimony that nothing is worthy of worship, that nothing is worthy of praise, and that nothing is worthy of our complete, sincere, and total devotion except Allah Almighty, the creator of the heavens and earth. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. And I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam of Arabia, a little over 1400 years ago, is his servant, his messenger, and the seal of the prophets. As-salatu wa-salam ala rasulihil kareem sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. May the peace and blessings of Allah forever be upon Prophet Muhammad, upon his companions, upon his descendants, upon the righteous servants, all of them, and upon us here in America and throughout the world. Ameen. So with that, we greet you once again today with the universal greeting words of peace in the Quran and Arabic language. Assalamu alaikum.
We're going to move you a little closer because they can't hear you.
Okay.
So we're going to move a little closer.
Okay. So I first want to thank the Imam and the staff here at MCMC for allowing us the opportunity to be with you today. I think it must have been about probably 8 years ago. I remember coming here and speaking during Black History Month. And we did talk at that time also about Malcolm X. And a lot of time has gone by since then. But as you can see, everyone is still interested in Malcolm, particularly in this community. Malcolm is the Muslim that most Muslims, even from overseas, they've heard of Malcolm. People know about Malcolm X. And there's so much information out there about Malcolm that when I was asked to come here today, I didn't know what I was going to say because there's just so much. But I think what I would like to start by doing is sharing with you some of my own reflections on Malcolm from what I knew of him, from what I picked up. The first time I remember hearing about Malcolm X, I was a very young man. I think I was maybe 16, 17 years old. And I remember we used to go over to New York, take the subway train over to New York, and we would, be walking around, and we would make our way up to Harlem and different places. And I remember we were walking down the street. It was near the Apollo Theater. And I remember we were walking down the street, and all of a sudden, we were about 3 or 4 of us, and one of my friends, he says, "Come on, let's get across the street. Let's get across the street." And so, "What do you mean, get across the street?" I had no idea what he was talking about. He said, just come on, I'll tell you later. And we ran across the street, actually, through the traffic and everything. But what happened, he saw the Muslims up in front of us in the direction we were going. And they were very sharp, the way the Muslim brothers dressed with the hats and the bow ties, et cetera, et cetera. And when we got to the other side, now we were watching them from across the street. And I didn't understand what was happening, and as I recall, these were the brothers that were coming along and preaching the message of the Nation of Islam at that time. And now here again, these friends of mine and myself, we ran from them, okay? And I found out later on, these were Muslims. So my idea, my concept of a Muslim was, a hat, bow tie, jacket, just the image that Malcolm presented. When Malcolm was preaching, the people who were supporting him in the Nation of Islam, they dressed like him. They presented themselves like him. And that was my earliest recollection of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Later on, as time went on, I found myself in the military. And this was after Malcolm X had been assassinated. This was after, I think it was right about 1970, because he actually was assassinated February 21st, I think was 64. So we're talking about 5 years later. And at that point, I still didn't know much about Malcolm X. And I just heard his name, you know, in a couple of different places and all. But as far as knowing anything about him or what the Muslims stood for, I had no idea, no clue. And at that time, I was drafted into the military under Nixon's draft, the draft lottery. And I was one of the first to get drafted, and found myself on the island of Okinawa in a barracks, okay? And the ratio at that time was about, as I remember, about 1/3 of the people there were African Americans. About 2/3 were Caucasians. And it was at that time where we had been listening to Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and Kwame Ture and all of these revolutionaries, so-called revolutionaries. And what happened in the barracks, okay, the only thing you had there was your stereo. Remember, this is before the internet, before anything. And I remember that a brother came in with a record, one of those 33 records, and it was called, it was Malcolm X, Message to the Grassroots. And that particular, you can get it for free on YouTube right now, it's just as my brother indicated. But with that message to the grassroots, I saw, because I was one of them, okay, a period in which we went from being in the dark about so many things, about who Malcolm was, about any of these issues, to having the lights turned on and having the wheels start turn in our heads. So with me, Malcolm X, it's a very personal experience that I had with him. But it's interesting that he had been gone for 5 years, and I began to love him based on an album, a speech that he had made. And I recommend that everybody here at least go to YouTube or someplace and listen to Message to the Grassroots. Malcolm was a master teacher. He knew how to teach by parable. And it was in that particular Message to the Grassroots that he uncovered many, many issues. And at that time, if you remember Dr. Martin Luther King, he was teaching nonviolence and turn the other cheek, etc. And Malcolm had a big problem with that, okay? And I remember he said regarding that violence, he said, you've been violent. You were violent in Korea, because many of our African American men were drafted in and went into the military. We went into Korea, to Japan, to different places, and we were violent. Malcolm reminded us of that. And during the speech, he said that you were violent in Germany, and you were violent in Korea, and you were violent in the South Pacific. He said, and everywhere the white man sent you to bleed, you bled. And he mentioned all of those places. He said, Germany and the South Pacific, you bled. He said, you bleed for white people. Now, this is his answer to what Dr. King was saying, okay? And at that same time, we have the incident of the 4 little black girls being killed in a jail, and in a church during Sunday school. And Malcolm, he by the time he broke it down, he said, you bled in Germany, you bled in Korea, you bled in Japan. He said, you bleed for white people. But when it comes time to seeing your own churches being bombed and little black girls murdered, you haven't got no blood. This was just one of the things that he comes out with in that particular album. And so what happened during that next period of time, I think was about a year and a half, 2 years, those stereos were blasting in the barracks while we were in the military. And everybody, whoever turned their radio on first or their stereo on first, that's what people were listening to. And we know our Caucasian soldiers, they had their, what we would call that honky-tonk music blowing. I mean, just burn. When we got our chance, we turned on Message to the Grassroots, and we would have it blasting. And we would have people come by, brothers who hadn't heard that would come by, and they would listen to it, and they would come in, what is that you got going? What is that? And then, that's Malcolm, brother, Message to the Grassroots. And then they would sit and listen, and then they would turn around and want to share that. Where can I get one? And the next thing you know, we had them being sent over. And because of Malcolm's voice, I actually saw the awakening of myself, as well as practically all of the African Americans who were there. And he said that when it comes time to seeing your little black girls murdered, you haven't got no blood. He said you bleed for white people in Germany and all over the place. You bled. However, when it comes to your own people, you haven't got no blood. The violence is, if it's wrong to be violent, it's wrong for you to be violent abroad, pardon me, and then turn around and not believe in violence here. That just resonated with so many people. And that particular experience, even though I'd never seen Malcolm X, I'd never been into his masjid, his mosque at that time, had never really known many Muslims at that time. That stuck in my mind. And when you think about it, it's the power, his oratory power to get his point across. And anybody who was part of that movement at that time, they can relate to that. And it got to the point where from then on, by the time it was time for me to come back to the United States side, I had to get to a mosque, had to get to a masjid just to find out what this was all about. And at that point, my brother-in-law had joined the Nation of Islam. And right before I came back, he was sending copies of Muhammad Speaks over, and all the brothers, they would come in there, and what we would do, you know, by that time, we had started looking at the military and this whole thing in a whole different light. And what I used to do, I was a radio operator, and so we had an hour break in the middle of the day. And I would open my Muhammad Speaks. I was being a good soldier now, okay? I was doing my job, but I would open my Muhammad Speaks and would have America the Beast and different things every week when the paper came in, you know, because our minds were being changed. And during that time, I knew people were watching, so I would go to places on occasion and just watch. And I would see people come over, and they would be looking at this paper, looking at the paper, and because the Muhammad Speaks, they had some artists in that paper that knew how to get their point across, okay? And it would always make you think. It would make you think. And in that particular one, America the Beast, it had a map of the United States, okay? And it showed a ship going in this direction, a ship going in that direction, planes going in that one, submarines going in this one, you know? And it just said, America the Beast. And it would tell you about how all of these places would be bombed, and in Vietnam. And you remember Muhammad Ali? What did he say when they told him to go to Vietnam? He said, ain't no Vietnamese never called me no nigger. He said, I don't have no quarrel with them people. And he paid the price. But he became, because of his steadfast in what he did, Muhammad Ali became one of the most loved people in and out of America. And people actually respected him. And then he, along with the rest of us, when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad returned to Allah in 1975, and his son became the leader, Imam Warithuddin Muhammad, then he turned the entire nation of Islam at that time toward the Sunnah path of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. About 2 million people, something like that. I think that might be, I know it's the largest transformation that ever took place in the U.S. I don't know about other countries, but I think it's close to being a record over there also. For one person, one man to turn the community in that direction. And we're always reminded of the Quran when it says to us that you were on the brink of the pit of fire and Allah saved you. He saved us from it. And I believe that to this day. You can see when you see the evolution of our people coming up through time from the Nation of Islam, from chattel slavery, okay, to a time when, it was the Nation of Islam that actually began the movement of black people calling themselves black instead of Negroes, because of that book that Elijah Muhammad put out. It's called Message to the Black Man. And that was the first time I remember anybody actually saying black, and we accepted it. Because before that, if somebody called you black, that was an insult. Get out of here, you little black son of a gun. That was the worst insult you could get, just being called black. And then turned around. Now think about the change in the mindset of the people, of us, as well as everybody. It doesn't even matter if you weren't Muslim. Right now, Christians everywhere call themselves black. I wonder if we realized that it was the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and his trumpet, Malcolm X, that was responsible for that. You see Malcolm, and actually that fire that was in him when you hear him speak, that was Elijah Muhammad. And both of them have returned to Allah now. There's a lot that people can talk about, going back and forth about Elijah Muhammad this and Malcolm that and so forth. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is the one who is the judge of all of us and them too. See? So when we think of Malcolm, he is an integral part of the evolution of the African American people to the point where we are right now. Malcolm played a key role in that. And so many, from that point, we began to listen to him more and more, because after he was assassinated, for a long time, you didn't hear that much about Malcolm. It wasn't the internet, it wasn't that. People were afraid of Malcolm when he was on the rostrum. Just like me and my buddies, we were afraid. We had to go across the street. But that movement, it continued and continued, and then all of a sudden, we have black people embracing the notion that they're black. Just like the brother before me, he mentioned that we had hated our noses, hated our lips, hated our complexion, hated to be what we were. But we gained a new respect for ourselves. And, one thing that we can see in retrospect is that we were covered in shame, and we were covered with shame as far as our color was concerned. And everything that we looked at, it had a color reference to it. And when you looked at the cake, the angel food cake, that was white. What about the devil's food cake? That's black. Angel food cake, devil's food cake. Then you have a little white lie. That's the why. That's the kind everybody tells. You know, everybody tells a little white lie. You know, but oh boy, what's left? That black lie. See how all of this stuff just, and that was stuff that was just internalized into us. And in closing, I just want to say that there's so much information on Malcolm on the internet, as our brother mentioned earlier. I didn't even touch on that. I just mentioned a couple of things from a personal standpoint. But I would really recommend that no matter where you are from, if you haven't read it, get a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X. Get a copy and read it for yourself. Go on YouTube, okay, and find out. See, you can hear his speeches, practically all of his speeches, and you can understand how that powerful voice. And we love him so much because of what he did for her. He stood up, and it actually cost him his life. But he did that not for himself. He did it for us because he was helping a cause which he thought was going to be significant, and actually was significant in the future to a lot of people. So, dear people, I've gotten a signal, and I just want to say thank you very much once again to Imam Rauf Zaman and his staff and all for putting this together. We thank Allah for your presence here today, and we pray Allah that each and every one of us